Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Mark and I thank you so much for coming by today. I just got back from a much needed 2-week vacation and I feel really great and I feel really rested. I didn't do a lot of artwork this time on my vacation, so not much to share with you there, but I did check a lot of the messages and emails and things I got on my last video, which is how to use white watercolor paint. And there was a question that kept coming over and over again. Can you please do a video on how to use black watercolor paint? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. There's a ton of black watercolor paints on the market, much more than there is white watercolor. So we'll get into that, which ones are which and why they're different. And we're going to get into how to use black watercolor paint as well. It's pretty straightforward. You use black watercolor paint like you'd use most other watercolor paints, but there are some little hidden gems that I can share with you that you might not know about already. And if you do know about them, maybe they're a good way to refresh and revisit. And we'll take a look at these different techniques and different ways to use black watercolor paint in just a minute. So the first thing I'm going to do is cut up a sheet of good quality watercolor paper into smaller squares. I always keep a small deck of these squares on my desk for when I just want to enjoy painting a small, quick piece without using a whole sheet of expensive paper. I have a bunch of watercolor sketchbooks, which I use all the time, but this is really good quality paper, and these squares are right there within reach when I want to just jump into a quick painting. I do the same thing with lower quality watercolor paper for swatches, tests, and even doodling. As I mentioned in my last video about how to use white watercolor paint, there's a bit of confusion and misinformation about black watercolor paint as well. When I was a young student, I was taught to never include black in my palette. My professor was strict in that we should only use a black that we achieved from mixing colors. And because I was taught to think this way, I just assumed it was right and I avoided buying black paint. But after a few years, I began to question this thinking. I mean, why else would manufacturers make black paint? Ironically, there's just a small handful of white paints we can buy, yet there are even more black paints on the market. And that's what can be really confusing, especially to younger artists, who buy them thinking they need to have them in their palette. Unfortunately, a lot of young artists assume black paint has only one purpose: to make colors darker. Well, black will definitely make colors darker, but the most common result when adding black to a color is frustration. Because depending on the black, the results can be really unexpected. In the classroom, I saw more projects go bad when students tried to add black to make shadows darker for a specific color. For example, when you mix certain blacks with yellows, it can produce a really muted green color. And oddly enough, this mistake happens in digital art too. Young artists turn up the black slider to darken a color to get a shadow instead of mixing colors correctly. It's one of the biggest struggles I see with young artists and designers, especially when I would teach color theory. And that's why I always begin that segment with black and white. So after all the feedback I got on how to use white watercolor, I thought it would be fun to share some ways I use black watercolor and just a few ideas that might enhance your creative journey too. The most simple and direct way I use black watercolor is right here like I'm doing, using black to create the outline of a drawing, and then pull out the black from those lines to create shadows and add some depth to the drawing. The more paint I put down in those lines, the more I can pull out after. And this can be done with any color, not just black. But like I said, this is probably the most simple way to use black watercolor. I should add that you can also do this with some black inks and most black gel pens too. You can see that in my Building a Travel Kit video. So what are some more ways to use black watercolor? Well, let's talk about that and more right after this black coffee break. As I said, there's a whole bunch of different black products available on the market in all different mediums: watercolor, ink, acrylic, gouache, and oil. And as many different kinds of black products there are even more brands available too. From Windsor Newton, Schmincke, Reeves, Arteza, Liquitex, and so many that I can't mention them all. For this discussion, I'm just going to talk about watercolor, which also includes gouache, which is an opaque version of watercolor. And there's a few black watercolor paints worth talking about, as they're probably the most common you'll see. The first is Mars Black, also known as matte black. It's named after Mars, the god of war. It dries with a warm, flat finish with no shine. Lamp black is a very intense, cool black made from carbon, oil, tar, or charcoal. Ivory black is smooth and warm and used to be made from burned ivory, but now it's made synthetically. Jet black is a glossy, smooth, cool black originally made from a wood and saltwater carbon gemstone called, you got it, jet. And number 5, Lunar Black by Daniel Smith. This is an unusual black because it's a high granulating, cool black that dries like a marbled moonscape. In my palette, I also use a paint called Neutral Tint in my range of blacks. It's made for mixing blacks and grays, and it's designed to reduce the saturation of colors more subtly than the intensity of most black paints. Another thing I'll add is that if you do like using black paints, then it's best to use a really good quality black paint. It gives much better results than a lot of student grade or inexpensive options. And with black, it usually shows. So, what's the point of black, and how exactly are we supposed to use it? Like any watercolor paint, it can be used right out of the tube or right out of the pan. Or, with a little water, it can be used to layer or glaze or create effects. Whatever way you like to use black watercolor paint is just fine. There is no wrong way. As long as it makes you happy, I say, go for it. But maybe there are other ways to use black watercolor paint that you haven't considered. And that's what I'd like to explore with you today. Something I do with all my new students, which I think is important for anyone new to using black watercolor paints, is to create a tonal or value chart just using paint and water. This really helps to understand a particular brand of paint, like Sakura or Cotman, as well as helping become familiar with just how black paints work on their own before introducing the colors. Then, after playing with it for a while and getting a good feel for it, we can see what other uses there may be for black watercolor paint. Number 1, to lay a background wash to create mood. For me, black has a single purpose in my palette, to create mood. It can be used in a small part of the piece or the entire piece. And setting the mood in a piece is how the viewer connects emotionally to it. With a white or brightly colored background, the mood can be cheerful even if the subject is dark. If a thriller novel has a cover with a bloody knife, the tone of the background can convey the mood to the reader. A bright background will be less threatening, while a dark background will be foreboding. And working with shades of gray between black and white, we can adjust the tone to fit the mood we're trying to convey. The second and most commonly used is, number 2, to lay a black wash over color to create a deeper, darker background. This is especially helpful when trying to create the image of light in the background, like a fiery sunset, a bright moon, or a candle or fireplace. By laying down the bright colors first, leaving the white of the paper as the brightest areas, we can overlay black around those bright colors to make them really pop off the page. Because the colors are underneath this black glaze or layer, they'll still be present in the black, making the darkest areas more harmonious to the brightest areas. And this can also be done by mixing other colors like Van Dyke brown or violet to get some really interesting effects. The third use is, number 3, to use with a white underpainting to create a monochromatic tonal painting. In my last video, How to Use White Watercolor, I explained how I enjoy laying down a layer of white paint on paper and then adding color on top. Once the wet color is applied, it activates the white underneath to produce some really wonderful tones and effects. Well, instead of using a color, we can simply use black watercolor paint instead to create some really interesting black and white results. The fourth use, number 4, is to create new blacks using color mixtures. Again, in the last video, I made pastel colors by mixing white paint with just a small amount of color. The same works for black watercolor paint as well, though typically more color is needed when used with black. Mind you, this can easily be done on the fly in small amounts on a separate palette, and you don't have to create a whole pan full of this color, which can be wasteful if you're not going to use it. For me, I love to have unique pans of color mixes and experiments in my primary palettes because I know I'll use them. Here, I'm going to create a simple little travel box using just Lunar Black with Pyrrole Red, Gamboge, Spring Green, Cobalt Blue, and Carbazole Violet, and see how these look with Lunar Black. It's as simple as just mixing them into a pan and then letting them dry. Once they're dry, a wet brush will reactivate the colors and the granulating black paint to create some really interesting effects. I'm also going to do the same thing with ivory black paint because I want to see how it will look with the colors added as well. Where the Lunar Black has that wild granulation going on, the ivory black is more subdued, I like them both very much for different reasons. I drew a quick portrait of the Beatles and I wanted to give them a unique look. I love the results and I can see myself using these colors for all kinds of projects. And keeping these pans separate from my primary tin of colors, I can use them alone or use them together. Finally, the fifth use is number 5, to draw out an initial sketch like I did earlier to create dark accents, the opposite of white. Black is great for pulling out the pigment and using to shade areas or add in some detail shades. If I were using markers, I could do the same thing with a light gray marker as well. You can see once I clean up the drawing, crop it out, and add a text graphic, the image seems to come together much clearer and with much more purpose. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video and took something away from it with you. Thank you so much for watching, and if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. And also, please leave comments below, as I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you use black watercolor paint, and maybe give me some ideas on things I can try as well. Thank you so much for coming by today. I wish you the best, keep creating, and God bless.